Hello and welcome to a new show from ILT, the Institute of Lutheran Theology. For those of you that don't know, ILT is an academic institution that includes undergraduate offerings at Christ College, as well as seminary and graduate offerings at the Christ School of Theology. My name is Kevin Swift. I'm an associate professor in the Office of Information Affairs at ILT, and I am also a PhD student at the Christ School of Theology. We here at ILT have an unwavering dedication to the Christian faith from a reformational perspective. We seek to be faithful, reformational, and global. And that's what we're going to do in this show. I want to bring the ILT faculty to you so that you can see the brilliant insights and benefit from the brilliant teaching that they have to offer. In order to do that, we have to set a foundation that we can use to build on. And that's precisely what we're going to do. We're going to talk about worldview and the Christian worldview. We're going to talk about some things that maybe were taught at your churches, but maybe your pastors weren't able to get into saying it out loud. Maybe it was just assumed. Maybe that wasn't taught because they just didn't have the time or the right setting in the sermons or the Bible studies that you've been a part of. So we're going to dig deep. We expect that anybody at maybe about an undergraduate level or above will be able to follow right along with us. But certainly anyone that's intellectually interested and ready to dive in is going to be an appropriate type of audience for this show. We expect to not only dig deep, but to go broad, and that's what our roots are going to be like. This show will go about 8 to 12 episodes. Since we're just laying a foundation, it won't go on forever. We'll see how it goes. But I am absolutely privileged to be joined by a brilliant scholar, Dr. Dan Lioy, and I will allow him to introduce himself as we start to do this fascinating view back on ourselves and our own foundation, maybe laying some foundational pieces or growing some roots that you didn't know were there. I hope you'll join us.
Greetings to everyone. I am Professor Dan Lioy. I am also at the Christ School of Theology, which is under the aegis or banner of the Institute of Lutheran Theology. My primary areas of research and writing are biblical theology, biblical studies, and also exegetical theology. And those are also the primary areas in which I teach at the graduate and postgraduate level.
As we get started, if we're going to discuss worldview and Christian worldview, the first thing that we're going to need to know is, well, what is a worldview? So here I have a quick definition of it that I use with my middle schoolers when I'm teaching them. And I just say it's simply just a way of seeing the world. Is that definition correct? Is it insufficient? There isn't enough there? Is it wrong? What is a worldview in your mind?
So I would see that as a basic starting point. It's perhaps putting the cookies, metaphorically speaking, on the bottom shelf, given the fact that our audience is going to be considerably higher than, say, middle school. Another way of understanding worldview, definitionally, would be a coherent system of thought that shapes the impressions people have about reality and their interpretation of the world. So it would include, for example, our assumptions, our values, our beliefs regarding the nature of existence, knowledge, morality, purpose, humanity's position within the universe. That's very broad. That's also very all-encompassing. We could even go further. Worldviews serve as a guiding lens through which people perceive events, make decisions, seek meaning, and find purpose. And then the last thing that I would add to that, one's worldview is influenced by various factors. This includes culture, religion, scientific understanding, and personal experiences. And we haven't even gotten into the realm of a Christian worldview. What I'm putting forward is more generic, it's more broad-based.
You gave a very sophisticated uh, definition of worldview, something much more sophisticated than the little one that I put there. indicating that maybe that first bullet of a way of seeing the world is a little bit insufficient. Uh, Not wrong, but maybe a little insufficient. So we'll see that as we go along, why worldview needs to be known, um, known in a more robust manner. But you did mention things like perspective in that. And I think it's easy when people think about worldviews to just think of like culture or possibly race or whatever grouping that you tend to that some tend to think of in terms of a particular viewpoint or a particular set of beliefs, that type of thing. So what would be your understanding in terms of trying to review for us again and essentially say again what worldview is? What is a culture versus a perspective versus a worldview? Can you clarify that so that we can make sure we're understanding what we're getting at with the term worldview?
So worldview primarily does involve the senses. It involves how we think. It involves how we engage the world around us. Culture is certainly one aspect of that. It also involves personal experiences. It can involve other people. Of course, culture involves other people, their personal experiences, their beliefs, their life experiences, as well as ours. But worldview boiled down using the word perception, uh, our understanding of reality, etc. I think those are all part of the mix. And it may be very much a struggle to come up with a, you know, boiled down, every satisfying everyone kind of notion of what worldview is, because it isn't really monolithic. It's varied, it's nuanced, it's various shades and hues of colors and gradients and so forth. And I think that's representative by the way in which you and I are even discussing it at a very high level.
Yes, I would agree. I would I would I would not say that it is something too fuzzy to define, right? So I wouldn't want to get
Correct.
to the point where we're thinking that, well, it's so fuzzy we can just kind of play with the definition at any time in order to get it to be what we want it to be for our purposes. We're gonna work hard uh, to avoid the fallacy of equivocation in terms of how we're talking about this.
Absolutely.
Um,
And in fact, I put forward a definition that I particularly have settled upon, as I mentioned earlier, a coherent system of thought that shapes the impressions people have about reality and their interpretation of the world. That's a very one sentence specific definition as I would put it forward. And then I have a couple of other descriptive statements, but it's that one sentence at the beginning that I think, for at least for me, sort of encapsulates what I would understand in a very basic way to be a worldview.
so when you say when you talk about reality in that statement,
Hmm.
is that getting at the same thing as truth? Because when I was thinking about it and thinking through this discussion that we've been having, we've been having this ourselves for a while now, but are now finally, finally recording our first episode. When I've been thinking about the discussions we've had, it's been
Yes.
a perspective on truth is where I have gone, but your definition speaks to reality. So is that one and the same? Are they where does is truth related? But how do you understand the understanding of truth and uh, you know how that plays into this more robust understanding of worldview?
So I would not collapse reality, the term reality and the term truth together and to form sort of a one notion conceptual under concept. That to me it would be incorrect. I see them as being related, but I see them as being distinct. In terms of truth, it depends upon what vantage point we are approaching it. So, for example, if we are in the Western intellectual tradition, say, for example, the global North, uh, the more Hellenistic understanding of truth is going to be factual information. It's going to be propositional statements. It's going to be very finely grained categorical assertions. That's one understanding of truth. In the Hebraic system, it's very different. It would include the Hellenistic notion, but truth is defined more existentially. It's more defined ontologically. Say, for example, John 14:6. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He doesn't give a litany of propositional statements. He doesn't deluge his followers with a boatload of declaratives and facts. He says, I am truth incarnate. So these are two different notional understandings of truth. In philosophical theology, truth tends to lean more in the direction of the Hellenistic understanding as dominant in the global north. In the biblical or Hebraic understanding, truth is going to include the experiential, the phenomenological, the ontological, if you will. For example, as incarnated in Jesus Christ, involving our feelings, our actions. Truth is defined in a much more robust way. And by the way, that's the way in which truth notionally is viewed within the majority world. The
Okay,
majority
so
world would include the global South. Let me just finish. It
yep.
would include Asia, Asia, South America, etc.
Okay, so clearly our terms are loaded, right? We're having we're having a fair trouble just trying to get a robust uh, understanding of worldview. I think at its core we understand what that is. We understand what this idea of a perspective of reality is and a way of seeing the world is really about. Uh, when we're talking truth, that clearly opens up a whole nother ball of wax, which
Hmm.
for those that have, maybe just started to study this, uh, it starts to open up a whole new avenue, sometimes which makes people just quit the philosophy program or makes them dive in more. And so that is where we're going to end up falling as we get into
Hmm.
this for sure. Uh, when I'm thinking truth, I'm thinking more simply in terms of uh, just what is true, right? And uh, does worldview frame for you what is true? So the things that I'm looking at here is the classic, the classic theories of truth, correspondence theory, uh, consensus theory, coherence theory, pragmatic theory. So correspondence theory would be, does it correspond to reality, right? So if you say something is true and then you go out into the real world and you do your manipulations or your experiments or whatever, and you find that that's true because that's what happens in the real world, then you say, yeah, it corresponds to the reality. It's true, right? Consensus theory saying, well, I've talked with a lot of experts or all of my friends, and they all say it's this, and I think it's that. So we all agree, right? So we have consensus. So it must be true because we have consensus. It seems when I first came across these theories of truth and studied them in my undergrad, uh, consensus seemed a little bit silly because it's like, well, uh, who cares if 500 people believe it? It could still be wrong. But the
Hmm.
fact is that in areas like science, for example, we go by a consensus theory of truth a fair amount, right? They, of course, run their experiments and things that could be considered more to correspond to the correspondence theory of truth, but there's still a fair amount of, well, they all think that it's the Big Bang that created the universe, or pick your theory, uh, and there's not necessarily 100% uh, evidence of that, right? There might be strong evidence, but they're not like 100% confirmed without a doubt. But everybody believes that because that's the consensus, right? That's what all the scientists agree to on whatever particular subject. Um, Coherence theory being, hey, does the theory is it coherent? Does it make sense together, right? Are there any contradictions in it? And then pragmatic, that's just, does it actually work, right? Um, is it useful? in the real world.
Hmm.
It's true if it really works and it's really useful in the real world. Those types of things for me seem to be wrapped up in a worldview, and how you're viewing reality is, well, you are thinking that's reality because you think it's true. Would you agree with that? Would you qualify with that? Uh,
I would
would
put
you
a
say that's
large
wrong?
qualification on that. All of those subcategories that you pointed out, they're ensconced primarily in the Western intellectual tradition. You mentioned science, you mentioned all sorts of other benchmarks and rubrics. But to be candid with you, those don't even track with the Hebraic's understanding of phenomenological epistemology, the use of sensory verbs. Just think, for example, of Proverbs, where it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. That is completely different and foreign to the notion of philosophical theology, for example, correspondence theories, consensus theories, coherence theories, and pragmatic theories. Those all speak into the Western intellectual tradition, but they don't necessarily speak into the Judeo Christian canon, at least pre second century AD in terms of Aristotle, Plato, and all those things. But when we're talking about the Hebraic notion of truth, of understanding, as I just pointed out, it also includes the ontological and the existential, none of which are encapsulated at all in this understanding of truth that you've demarcated here on the slide.
Well, so the epistemology would be about how we know something, right? It's about the nature of knowledge.
Hmm.
Uh, Certainly, how you understand truth. Uh, these four theories would be related to epistemology, how you know whether or not something is true.
In the Western intellectual tradition.
So, but in the case of uh, in the case of the Hebraic worldview, for example, they uh, they know that a prophet is a true prophet based upon whether or not what they predicted comes to pass.
That's not
Correct?
entirely accurate. No, that's not entirely accurate. The provenance or the bona fides of a prophet are established especially by whether they're accredited or not. That is to say, from the Lord. This is even before they even open their mouths. There's a whole an epistemological notion of truth, of reality, of worldview within the Hebraic system that I think runs parallel to and is not necessarily always in alignment with what is considered to be, as I described it earlier, the Western intellectual tradition. And I think our viewers need to clearly understand that we're talking about like a left brain, right brain kind of distinction, and they shouldn't be collapsed together, or to assume, for example, that somebody who's trained in philosophy, philosophical theology, modal
Mm-hmm.
logic, and their usage of the noun truth is the exact same way that it's understood within the Judeo Christian canon, because that would be patently incorrect.
Hmm. But ultimately, it is God who created the world, and so his world that he has created is going to correspond to reality, is it not?
Again, I would not disagree with that. I would affirm that that is the case. However, Scripture and its approach to the notion of truth leans very heavily in the direction of the ontological and the existential, as opposed to, say, precisely worded declarative statements, propositional declarations, things that we can measure scientifically, mathematically, with
Mm-hmm.
precision in a finely honed series, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I would say my understanding of these particular theories of truth don't necessarily have to do with deductive logic and propositions and the various other things that you get into with your intro logic course. So I would just we'll have to explore that more, and maybe we'll circle back to this and these different categories of truth
Sure.
because there's an interesting overlap and an interesting dissonance with our understanding of what we're getting at there. But the main thing we want to understand that I think that you and I agree on is that certainly a worldview does have to do with an understanding of truth.
Hmm.
To, in fact, you proved that well by speaking at length to the Hebraic worldview and
Hmm.
how the Hebraic worldview maybe has some differences with understanding truth that these categories maybe don't speak very well to or don't categorize well.
So
They
let me put forward the statement that distinctions between the Hebraic and the Hellenistic approaches doesn't mean necessarily disagreement. I think that they can be placed constructively in conversation with one another, but I think it's important that they are placed in conversation and that the distinctions between the two are fully realized. Otherwise, we're going to take, for example, notions of truth, quote unquote, in philosophical theology and anachronistically impose them onto Scripture when in fact that's a misread of what Scripture is talking about when it uses the word truth. For example, John chapter 18, Jesus is before Pontius Pilate, and he cynically he retorts, "Well, what is truth?" And he doesn't even realize that he's in the presence of the one who is truth incarnate. But again, that's ontological. That's an existential understanding, if you will, of what truth is.
Well, and we're going to have to be once again to avoid the fallacy of equivocation. Clearly, as we dive into this in this series, we're going to have to be very clear and careful about what we're really saying when we say truth, because it very well may be that the different worldviews, Western versus Hebraic, or even more individual, mine versus yours, we may just be working with different definitions, right, as well.
Hmm.
So, but I think this all, even just this short time that we've circled on this word truth, has very clearly shown that truth and understanding of truth is a big part of what a worldview is. And not only that, but we can also, to your point, find that just because we say that there are some differences in terms of how worldviews view a particular thing, truth or whatever it might be, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're contradictory, right? It doesn't
Exactly.
necessarily mean that there's a contradiction. In some cases, that's going to be the case, but it's not always. Um, we're not necessarily defining buckets where one worldview has to be all right and
Correct.
one worldview has to be all wrong.
By the way, if I could insert the thought, in the approach that I'm advocating, first of all, I'm not talking about relativism, that there are no that there is no understanding that truth can be specific and declarative and propositional. In fact, I would even argue that in making the statement that Jesus is truth incarnate, you can't get a much more any more absolutized notion of what truth is. It's focused and it's absolutized in Jesus Christ. He is truth, the embodiment of truth, the enfleshment of truth for all of humankind. That to me is a very absolutist, specific way of understanding truth.
So we've already addressed a number of the points that I wanted to address in this first episode, as viewers of these talks can see. Um, that second bullet point, is it all relative? If so, how? If not, so you've just started to address that. I think we've already addressed at length the first one, which uh, is it more than just about how one perceives truth, or does that pretty well encapsulate it? I think we've very clearly said that it has more to do with just how one perceives truth, because even just the even just the
Hmm.
definition of the word truth. So there's some semantics, and not uh, that word is not used pejoratively, right? The semantics are
Correct.
important. Um, there is some semantics and some particulars here that we're going to have to dive into. So it clearly is more than that. You've just mentioned that it is very much not relative, and spoken to how Jesus' life is evident of that. Uh, is there some other ways, some even more um, simple or concrete ways that you would that you would say that worldview is not relative, or
Well, let me use an example. So, for example, at the Institute of Lutheran Theology, one luminary is Gerhard Ferde, and he makes the distinction between being um, be, the distinction between a theology of the cross, which can come across as being sort of ethereal, uh, theoretical, and on being a theologian of the cross. On being a theologian of the cross is something that we live out, something that is part of our everyday human experience. Whereas the other one, it's much more abstracted, it's much more theoretical. So when we're talking about a worldview, yes, it's something that we might intellectually assent to, but it's also something that impacts the way that we live. And that to me is a bringing together of both the Hebraic and the Hellenistic notions of worldview, of truth, of perception, of understanding. Yes, it involves the mind, but it also involves the heart. And that's the way that I think is most appropriate to engage this conversation so that we take in both aspects and rather than just one or the other.
so when you talk that it has to do with the heart and things like that, uh, I think that can come across fairly um, ambiguous. Uh, that can come across as something that can be a bit relative, frankly, in terms of being able to be defined um, by whoever wants to define what
Hmm.
the heart is. Uh, but if I'm hearing you correctly, it very much has to do with, to your point about Gerhard Ferdy's comments. Um, it has very much to do with an application to real life, that you're not just speaking about theology or philosophy or the way that you see the world in terms of abstract terms or in terms of
Hmm.
generalities, but that instead it really has to do with being able to speak to how it affects your day to day, or how it affects your community, how it affects your life in your church, or things of that nature, and that's where it would it would be concrete. Is that
Certainly.
and not relative? Is that a correct understanding of what you were saying earlier?
I think that's all fine and good. Scripture, of course, is the ultimate norming norm. So someone make the notion or put forward the idea, well, if you're talking about the heart, that can be rather vague, general, nebulous. The counterpoint would be that even talking about the so-called head, cognition, volition, what we think, there can actually be a fair bit of vagueness to it, abstractedness to it, disconnectedness to it. And sometimes people, when they talk very categorically, in terms of thinking, in terms of propositional statements, in terms of declaratives, they actually might be uh, getting much more concrete and much more specific than the data, the evidence actually can bear the weight of. So I think a fair bit or a good dose of humility, whether we're talking about the head or the heart, when it relates to worldview, whether it relates to truth, whether it relates to epistemology, how do we know what we know? A fair bit or a fair dose of humility, I think, is in order in all of these different areas.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to circle back on these conversations and see how they expand and gain weight, or become more robust as we have them. Because
Hmm.
you know, I keep hearing things that make me think back to like a correspondence theory of truth, which is saying, well, it's going to correspond to reality. There's going to be an aspect to where we're not just out in the weeds, and that type of thing can happen. Um, that type of thing can happen both when you're speaking philosophically in generalities, as well as when you're trying to do specifics with like a propositional logic. Is you can start to get into hypotheticals and other things like that, where even though you're narrowing down, you're actually getting away from the reality of your day to day.
I think scripture in particular helps to keep us grounded. It helps to keep us focused at the parish level with our congregants, with the rough and tumble of daily life. And that's certainly my hope for this whole exchange, this conversation about worldview, about truth, and so forth and so on.
So, and we're going to have technical difficulties as I just had from time to time, and we're gonna have to
Roll with
eventually
it.
let those go. We're gonna have to roll
Hmm.
with it.
That's
We
right.
are at time, but I want to speak to what we'll be able to get into in future weeks, since that's really where we were already going. We will be speaking to things like the missiological approach to worldview. So this is different ways to understand worldview and different different kind of categories
Hmm.
of different worldviews. After we get into that, or as we get into those types of categories and understandings of worldview, we'll be able to start to talk about the Christian worldview particularly, and where we can start with that to build out the foundation that we as Christians should already know, but maybe haven't either thought a lot about or haven't heard said explicitly and directly.
Hmm.
So,
Absolutely.
so
It's
I
exciting.
it, I am excited. I can see that as we get into this, it could be even a little more contentious than, than I thought, which I think should be interesting because we'll be able to really we'll be able to find distinctions that will be important through conversations like what we've had today. I hope the listeners uh, hear that as well, um, and are as excited as we are.
Without a doubt.
All right. Well, we will see you uh, in the next episode. We'll be uploading a couple of these at the beginning. So if you are interested to hear more, you can go right on to the next one. Otherwise, we'll be releasing them regularly.
Stop recording. Give me a second here. Done.